journalists, on the other hand, shouldn't have what you called a glass jaw when it comes to some of these investigations, citing the First Amendment and threats to the First Amendment?
Well, the First Amendment is a critically important part of the Constitution. It is not unconditional.
At 86, Tom Brokaw is officially out of dams to give. He's the last of the Titans, the guy who watched the Berlin Wall crumble.
You know, it's getting very restless in Germany. Wire Everything tonight, we're going live from Berlin. The top of the wall was filled with West German students.
While the rest of us were still figuring out our VCRs. For a long time, he kept his thoughts on Savannah Guthrie tucked away in a neat professional box. But the box just flew open. Now, the legend is finally weighing in on the woman who redefined his old stomping grounds, and he's not holding back. The bombshell. So, here's the thing about being 86. You stop caring about the corporate holiday card list. Tom Brokaw has spent half a century being the voice of God, the guy whose vocal cords sounded like expensive mahogany and a very dry martini. He was the gold standard, the man who narrated the end of the 20th century without breaking a sweat or losing his pocket square. But lately, the legendary anchor has been watching the Today Show from a very different vantage point. His ranch, far away from the synthetic glow of Studio 1A, and he finally has some thoughts on the woman currently steering the ship. Enter Savannah Guthrie. When Tom looks at Savannah, he isn't just seeing a news anchor, he's seeing a revolution in a power suit. For years, the rumor mill in the 30 Rock hallways whispered that the old guard, the guys who remember when news was delivered by men with deep voices and zero emotions, weren't exactly thrilled with the new, more caffeinated direction of morning TV. But Brokaw just blew that narrative out of the water. He didn't come out with a dry, prepared statement through a publicist. Instead, he gave us the equivalent of a wink and a nudge, acknowledging that Guthrie isn't just filling in for the legends of the past. She's essentially reinventing the wheel while driving the car at 80 miles per hour. She's got the legal brain of a prosecutor and the relatability of a neighbor. A source close to the veteran anchor suggested he's been saying behind closed doors. And honestly, that's the ultimate Brokaw compliment. Tom was always the guy who wanted the facts straight, but he also knew how to tell a story. In Savannah, he sees someone who can grill a world leader until they squirm, then pivot effortlessly to a segment about the best air fryer recipes without looking like she's lost her soul. It's a tightrope walk, and Brokaw, the ultimate tightrope walker, finally decided it was time to give her her flowers. But let's be real, this isn't just about professional courtesy. There's a bit of spilled tea here, too. The transition from the Brokaw era to the Guthrie era wasn't exactly a smooth paved road. It was more like a distracted drive through a construction zone. When Matt Lauer's career went up in a spectacular mushroom cloud of scandal, the house that Brokaw helped build was shaking at the foundations. There was a moment there where NBC News looked less like a powerhouse and more like a sinking ship. Tom watched from the sidelines as Savannah stepped into that wreckage. He saw her take the hits, handle the awkward on-air apologies, and somehow keep the lights on. Brokaw's recent speaking up isn't a critique, it's a validation. He's essentially saying, yeah, I see what you did there. He recognizes that Savannah had to do something he never really had to. She had to be vulnerable. In Tom's day, if an anchor cried on air, people checked the thermostat. In Savannah's day, if you don't show a little humanity, the audience flips the channel to a TikTok compilation of cats. Brokaw's pivot to praising her shows he's not just an old-timer stuck in 1984. He's a guy who understands that the voice of God has been replaced by the voice of the friend. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Here is the man who reported on the fall of the Berlin Wall, essentially giving a thumbs up to a woman who has to spend 20 minutes of her morning talking about viral memes before she hits the hard politics. Some might have expected him to be grumpy about it, the classic get-off-my-lawn approach to journalism. Instead, he's been surprisingly candid about her steely resolve. He's noted that while his generation was about the delivery, Savannah's generation is about the connection. It's a massive shift in the tectonic plates of broadcast news. Brokaw speaking up now feels like a benediction. It's as if the King of the North just rode down to the South to tell the new queen she's doing a solid job with the dragons. He's noted her prosecutorial edge, a nod to her law degree that she wields like a scalpel during interviews. You can almost see Tom sitting in his leather chair, nodding as Savannah traps a politician in a logic loop. That's the old pro recognizing the new pro. Of course, the internet went wild. People love a clash of the titans story, but what they got instead was a passing of the torch that felt surprisingly warm. It wasn't a lecture, it was an observation. Brokaw's voice, though a bit raspier these days, still carries the weight of history. When he says Savannah Guthrie is the real deal, the industry stops and listens. It's the ultimate seal of approval from a man who has seen every fad, every scandal, and every next big thing come and go. He knows that Savannah isn't trying to be him. And more importantly, he knows that the world doesn't want her to be. They want Savannah, the quick-witted, slightly anxious, highly brilliant mother of two who happens to be the most powerful woman in news. Brokaw's speaking up was the final piece of the puzzle, a bridge between the era of the typewriter and the era of the touchscreen. But before she was the queen of the morning, she was just a kid with a law degree and a dream. Brokaw's Wild West. Before we can really appreciate where Savannah is sitting, we have to look at the dust and gravel that Tom Brokaw had to kick up to build the road in the first place. Imagine a world where the internet didn't exist. News came in on physical paper that smelled like ink and sweat, and the evening news was basically a secular version of church. That was Tom's playground. It wasn't just a job. It was a high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled Wild West where the legends were made of leather and ego. Tom wasn't just a face on a screen. He was the guy who made you feel like the world was ending. But it was okay, because he was the one telling you about it. Tom's story starts in South Dakota, which is about as far from the neon lights of 30 Rock as you can get without hitting a different planet. He was a kid from the prairie, with a voice that sounded like it belonged on a radio before he even hit puberty. But he wasn't just a pretty voice. Tom had this restless energy, a sort of frontier spirit that didn't fit into a 9-to-5 box. He worked his way through the local stations, learning the hard way that in the news business, if you aren't first, you're extinct. By the time he hit the big leagues in the 60s and 70s, the golden age of journalism was just starting to bake, and Tom was right there in the kitchen. Back then, the newsroom wasn't the sterile glass and chrome palace we see today. It was a chaotic, loud, cigarette smoke-filled bunker. There were no teleprompters that worked 100% of the time, no Google to fact-check a senator's lies in 3 seconds, and certainly no social media team to make sure your hair looked on brand for the 6 p.m. slot. It was raw. It was masculine. It was, frankly, a bit of a Shark Tank. Tom thrived in it. He had this uncanny ability to stay cool while the world was literally catching fire around him. Whether it was the Watergate scandal or the visceral, heartbreaking reality of the Vietnam War, Brokaw was the steady hand on the tiller.
The only one of the big three.
Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw.
And we were competing all day, every day.
He became part of the big three, Jennings, Rather, and Brokaw. These guys were more than just anchors. They were the arbiters of truth for 100 million people. If Tom said it happened, it happened. There was a gravity to the role that's hard to explain to someone who grew up with news alerts popping up on their watch. You didn't just check the news. You waited for Tom to give it to you. He traveled the globe, flying into war zones with a notebook and a prayer, proving that he wasn't just a suit who sat behind a desk.
It was 30 years ago tonight, and I will always remember when the Berlin Wall came down and thousands of East Germans poured across the border to be united with their fellow citizens.
He was a reporter's reporter. He was the guy who stood at the Berlin Wall in 1989, sensing the tectonic plates of history shifting beneath his boots, and told the world that the Iron Curtain was finally being shredded. But it wasn't all glory and historical milestones. The Wild West era had a dark side. It was a grueling, life-consuming grind. Brokaw has often talked about the toll it took. The missed birthdays, the holidays spent in hotel rooms in countries most people couldn't find on a map, the constant pressure to be the smartest person in the room. He lived his life in 30-minute increments. The voice of God persona required a level of perfection that would break most people. You couldn't have a bad day when you were the person the country looked to during a national crisis. You had to be bulletproof. And then there was the ego. You don't get to the top of the NBC mountain without a healthy dose of self-belief. The competition between the networks was legendary and often petty. It was a blood sport. Tom wasn't just fighting for ratings, he was fighting for the soul of the American narrative. He was the golden boy, the guy who seemed to have it all. The looks, the brain, the career, and the respect of his peers. But even golden boys get tired. As the 90s bled into the 2000s, the world started to change. The 24-hour news cycle was born, and suddenly, the slow, deliberate pace of the evening news started to feel like a relic. Tom saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the era of the greatest generation, a term he literally coined and turned into a best-selling book, was passing. He was the chronicler of that generation, the man who gave voice to the men and women who survived the Depression and won World War II. In a way, Tom was the bridge between that stoic, do your job and don't complain world, and the hyper-connected emotional world we live in now. He worked with the giants, he interviewed the monsters and the saints, and he did it all with a level of class that seems almost extinct today. When he finally stepped down from the nightly news chair in 2004, it felt like the end of an empire. People cried. It was the closing of a chapter in American life. But Tom didn't just vanish into the South Dakota sunset. He stayed around, a ghost in the machine, watching as the industry he loved began to fracture. He watched as the internet tore the gatekeepers down. He watched as the news became less about what happened and more about how do we feel about what happened. And he watched as a young, sharp-as-a-tack lawyer named Savannah Guthrie started making waves in the very building where he'd spent his life. He didn't know it then, but the Wild West was about to get a new sheriff, and she didn't look anything like the guys who came before her. Because while Tom was building the foundation, Savannah was busy learning how to tear down the walls. Savannah's ascent. If Tom Brokaw's career was a slow-burn prestige drama filmed on 35mm, Savannah Guthrie's rise was more like a high-speed legal thriller edited for the TikTok generation. She didn't come up through the police scanner and local pancake breakfast circuit in the same way the old guard did. Savannah was a different breed of cat entirely. She was a lawyer first, a litigator who knew how to find the crack in a witness's story before they even finished their sentence. When she traded the courtroom for the newsroom, she brought that "don't mess with me" energy into a building that was still arguably a bit of a boys' club. Savannah didn't just walk into 30 Rock and get handed the keys to the kingdom. She had to fight for every inch of sidewalk. She started out doing the grunt work, the kind of reporting where you're standing outside the White House in a freezing drizzle at 4 a.m., waiting for a press secretary who's probably going to lie to you anyway. But there was something about her. She had this approachable brainiac vibe. She could explain a complex Supreme Court ruling like she was talking to you over a glass of Chardonnay, but then turn around and grill a politician until they started sweating through their foundation. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Today Show desk. Stepping into that spot is like stepping onto a landmine wrapped in a velvet cushion. It's the most coveted job in morning television, and it's also the most dangerous. When Savannah joined the team in 2011, the show was in the middle of a transition that felt more like a messy divorce. The audience was loyal, but they were also wary. Then came the 2017 earthquake, the Matt Lauer scandal. For decades, Matt had been the face of the franchise, the guy everyone woke up with. When he was gone in a flash of headlines and HR reports, the building didn't just shake, it imploded. That was Savannah's moment. It was her trial by fire, and the world was watching to see if she'd melt. Instead, she sat at that desk next to Hoda Kotb and did something Brokaw's generation almost never did. She was honest. She didn't hide behind a teleprompter or a voice of God script. She admitted she was heartbroken, confused, and doing her best to process the news in real time with the viewers. It was a masterclass in modern leadership. She didn't just report the news. She lived it with us. That's when the Savannah era truly began. She redefined what it meant to be a morning host. Before her, you were either the serious news person or the fun lifestyle person. Savannah decided she could be both, and she did it without the identity crisis. She'd be at the Republican National Convention one day, navigating a sea of red hats and shouting matches, and the next day she'd be back in the studio laughing at a segment about how to organize your junk drawer. It was a level of range that even the veterans had to respect. She wasn't trying to be the female Tom Brokaw. She was busy being the first Savannah Guthrie. The critics, of course, had their knives out. They called her too sharp, or they nitpicked her style, or they wondered if two women hosting the show would work, as if the previous 50 years of men doing it was the only way physics allowed. But Savannah just kept leaning into her strengths. Her interviewing style became her signature. She has this way of asking a question with a smile that's actually a trap. She'll let a guest talk themselves into a corner, and then, with the precision of a surgeon, she'll point out the one thing they forgot to lie about. It's brilliant to watch, and it's exactly why Tom Brokaw eventually sat up and took notice. Behind the scenes, her ascent was just as grueling as Tom's, just in a different way. While Tom was dodging bullets in war zones, Savannah was dodging the digital bullets of the 24-hour outrage cycle. In the age of Twitter, X, and instant feedback, every word she said was scrutinized by millions of amateur editors. She had to maintain her composure, while the very definition of truth was being debated every single day. She wasn't just delivering the news, she was defending the concept of it. She also had to do it all while being a mom. Savannah has been incredibly open about the miracle of her children, born later in her life, and the exhaustion that comes with balancing a high-stakes career with a toddler who doesn't care about the debt ceiling. That relatability is her superpower. When viewers see her with a slightly tired look in her eyes after a long night with the kids, they don't see a distant news goddess. They see themselves. She turned the Today Show into a kitchen table conversation, and in doing so, she saved the franchise from becoming a museum piece. Her path wasn't a straight line. It was a climb up a glass mountain during a blizzard. She had to outwork everyone, outthink the skeptics, and outlast the scandals. By the time Brokaw reached his mid-80s and started reflecting on who was carrying the torch he'd lit so many decades ago, Savannah was the obvious answer. She had the grit of the old school and the heart of the new. She wasn't just a face on a screen. She was the person holding the room together when everything else was falling apart. But even the strongest people have their breaking points, and the price of that success is rarely ever free. While the bright lights were shining on her professional wins, the shadows in her personal life were growing longer. The human stuff. For Tom Brokaw and Savannah Guthrie, the distance between the anchor and the person has occasionally collapsed in ways that were both terrifying and profoundly humbling. For Tom, the transition into his 80s wasn't just about retiring and playing golf. It was a brutal confrontation with his own mortality. In 2013, the man who had survived war zones and political coups was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer that doesn't care how many Emmys you have on your shelf. Suddenly, the voice of God was grappling with the fragility of his own bones. Tom didn't just retreat into a private cocoon, though. In true Brokaw fashion, he chronicled it.
10 years ago, national news anchor and South Dakota native Tom Brokaw wasn't feeling well. Doctors diagnosed him with a rare form of cancer.
He wrote about the lucky life he'd led and the reality of facing a finish line that was suddenly visible on the horizon. There's something incredibly poignant about watching a Titan age. Tom has been candid about the dreadful parts of getting older, the loss of stamina, the way the world starts to move a little too fast for your liking, and the realization that you are no longer the one setting the agenda. He spent his 80s leaning into his family and his beloved Montana ranch, finding a different kind of peace that doesn't require a satellite uplink. But that peace came at a price. It required him to let go of the identity that had defined him for 60 years. He had to stop being Tom Brokaw, NBC News, and start being Tom Brokaw, husband and grandfather. It sounds easy, but for a guy who lived on the adrenaline of a breaking news bulletin, it was a profound psychic shift. Then you look at Savannah. If Tom's struggle was about the end of the journey, Savannah's has been about the grueling, beautiful chaos of the middle. She's been open, sometimes painfully so, about her path to motherhood. Starting a family in her 40s wasn't a celebrity breeze. It was a journey of needles, prayers, and IVF. When she finally had Vale and then Charlie, she didn't just tuck them away with a nanny. She brought the reality of working mom guilt to the forefront of the national conversation. There were mornings where Savannah would be on air, looking flawless, while her brain was actually back home wondering if the baby's fever had broken or if she'd remembered to pack the right snack for preschool. That's a kind of human stuff that Tom's generation of men never had to deal with. In Tom's day, the wives handled the home front, so the great men could go out and conquer the news. Savannah is doing both. She's conquering the news at 7 a.m. and then negotiating with a toddler over broccoli at 4 p.m. The mental gymnastics required to stay sharp enough to interview a prime minister while being sleep-deprived from a teething infant is a feat of human endurance that rarely gets enough credit. And then there's the physical toll. People forget that Savannah nearly lost her eyesight in one eye after a freak accident involving her son and a toy train. She had to undergo multiple surgeries, sit in the dark for weeks, and face the very real possibility that her career, a career built on looking at things and being looked at, might be over. She came back to the desk wearing glasses, looking vulnerable, and once again, she didn't hide it. She told the story. She let the audience in on the fear. This is where Tom and Savannah truly connect, despite the 40-year age gap. They both understand that the mask of the anchor eventually has to crack. For Tom, it cracked under the weight of illness and age. For Savannah, it cracked under the weight of life's unpredictable curveballs. Brokaw's recent comments about her weren't just about her prosecutorial skills, they were about her resilience. He recognizes a fellow survivor when he sees one. He knows what it's like to keep showing up when your body or your heart is telling you to stay in bed. There's a quiet dignity in how they've both handled their human stuff. They didn't turn their struggles into a tawdry reality show. They handled them with the same grit they used to handle their reporting. Tom's battle with cancer and Savannah's journey through high-risk pregnancies and eye surgeries are the hidden files of their resumes.
Still, in the near decade since his diagnosis, Tom says the blood cancer, which affects bone marrow blood cells, has taken its toll on him. Quote, "I've had a bad experience. I kept thinking bad things wouldn't happen to me. But as I grew older, I began to develop this condition."
They are the things that make their voices crack just a little bit when they talk about what really matters. In a world that demands perfection and curated lives, their willingness to be broken and to mend themselves in front of us is what makes them icons. Tom isn't just a legend because he was at the Berlin Wall. He's a legend because he's facing his 80s with his head held high. Savannah isn't just a star because she's smart. She's a star because she's real. When Tom looks at her, he doesn't see a TV personality. He sees a person who has walked through the fire and come out the other side with her sense of humor intact. That's the bond. It's not about the teleprompter. It's about the scars we can't see. But as much as they share a human connection, the world they inhabit has fundamentally fractured. The death of the anchor. Let's be honest, the anchor, as we once knew it, is dead. Or, at the very least, it's on life support in a room filled with flickering monitors and TikTok influencers. When Tom Brokaw was the king of the mountain, the news anchor was a secular priest. He sat behind a desk that looked like it was carved out of a single piece of granite, and he delivered the truth with a capital T. There was no feedback loop. You didn't get to talk back to Tom. You didn't get to tweet at him that his tie was crooked or that you disagreed with his framing of the tax bill. He was the final word. But that world has evaporated. We now live in a fractured, choose-your-own-adventure reality where the voice of God has been replaced by a million screaming voices on a dozen different platforms. The very idea of a national conversation feels like a quaint relic from a museum, right next to the rotary phone and the floppy disk. This is the world Savannah Guthrie inherited, a world where the pedestal has been chopped down to ground level. And this is exactly why Brokaw's endorsement of her is so fascinating. He's essentially admitting that his way of doing things, the stoic, distant, objective statue of a man, wouldn't survive in today's climate. If Tom were starting out today, he'd be expected to have a podcast, a curated Instagram feed, and the ability to trend for the right reasons. The era of the untouchable anchor is over, and in its place is the era of the relatable professional. Savannah is the poster child for this shift. She has to be a journalist, yes, but she also has to be a brand, a personality, and a friend. She has to navigate a landscape where half the audience thinks the mainstream media is the enemy, and the other half is busy watching a 3-minute summary of the news on their phone while waiting for their latte. To survive that, you can't be a statue. You have to be fluid. You have to be able to jump from a segment on a school shooting to an interview with a pop star without losing your credibility or your mind. The death of the anchor doesn't mean the death of news, but it does mean the death of the mystery. We know too much about our anchors now. We know what Savannah's kids look like, what books she's reading, and how she feels about her morning coffee. In Tom's day, that would have been seen as a weakness, a distraction from the serious work. But in Savannah's day, it's the only thing keeping the lights on. Authenticity is the new objectivity. If people don't like you, they won't trust you. It's a popularity contest with nuclear stakes. Brokaw sees this. He's smart enough to realize that the industry didn't just change. It evolved into a different species. He doesn't look at the current state of morning TV and scoff at the lightheartedness. Instead, he seems to marvel at the fact that Savannah can maintain her integrity while performing in what is essentially a 3-hour live stage play every single morning. He knows that the golden age is gone, but he's signaling that the Savannah age is its own kind of miracle. The pedestal is gone, the granite desk is now a glass table, and the voice of God is now a conversation. It's messy, it's loud, and it's often exhausting. But by speaking up, Brokaw is reminding us that while the medium has changed, the person holding the microphone still matters. The anchor might be dead, but the storyteller is more important than ever. And as the sun sets on one legendary career, the final words are finally being spoken. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of your favorite icons.